Okay, we're going to get ready. All right, so I think we're good to go, right? All right, so welcome to week 2 of German 59, which is the Holocaust in Film and Literature. Couple of things, just housekeeping. Hopefully everyone went to their sections on Friday. I talked to the TAs and they said the vast majority of you were there, which is great. Those who had to miss section, if you did, you have some kind of a little form for traveling, sports-related interviews, whatever. Please make sure you get that to your TAs so that you have an excused absence if you have to miss section. It's important that they have that documentation so that you don't get marked down. Your first paper is due on Thursday evening, uploaded to Turnitin, and I'll kind of go through this again today so you can make sure you know how to do it. I wanted you to make sure that you're both looking at the syllabus as well as the CCLE website. So CCLE only has on it the readings that are PDF files, the videos, and it's the means in which you turn stuff in. On the syllabus, it tells you what we're doing for the day, as well as gives you some additional web resources. Those web resources, I'll sometimes take screenshots, or I'll sometimes look at them. Sometimes they're just like additional information. If I don't spend a lot of time on it in class, you don't have to worry about it. However, I would say a lot of this, again, is interest-driven. You wanted to find out more about the Nazi book burnings. Well, click on this link and there'll be more information. I mentioned it in passing. Generally, I should say that the stuff is organized in order of importance as well. So I would say if you had to start at the top, work your way down as you go. So on CCLE, just in case there's any questions, remember it's organized readings week by week. Sometimes I put readings together as a little bundle. So if you can't find something, it's most likely in the bundle of readings. So that's where you should look. Media resources. This is an important one down there. Easy to miss. Click on it and you get some great stuff. One is the link to Bruincast, so you can get the Bruincast for all the videocasts of lectures, and then the videos for the class. These are on Video Furnace, and like I said, sometimes you have stuff on YouTube, sometimes you don't, but they're all the films and their different parts. Okay, video reserves, Bruincast, the lectures, and also every week I'll put the slides for the entire week up. So in a given week, this will always be on Thursdays, just because I am making slides all the way until we meet in class. So slides for week 1 are here, all of them, easy to review. Okay? So obviously we're on week 2, and these are readings that are there for week 2. And I just want to show you again where the Turnitin is. So let's see, there we go. So at the end, right there, it says response paper number 1. This is where you click and you upload your paper in a format that we can read it in, like a doc or a PDF file, and do that before 11:59 on Thursday. Okay? One small reminder about the papers. Maybe the word response is slightly misleading, I don't know. It is supposed to be a response, that is to say it's your response to the readings. But it's not just a response. I mean, it's not like I liked it, I didn't like it, it gave me a headache. I'm obviously looking for more of an academic argument in your response. And so I wrote down very clearly at the bottom here what makes an excellent response paper. So the paper should have a point. You should have some kind of argument that you're trying to advance, and you're supporting that using evidence. That evidence can be selected from stuff that's on the syllabus. So I didn't go over Triumph of the Will, in great detail. You can do a close analysis of that. That would be great. There are examples of propaganda that I showed you and will continue to look at today in class, like the Eternal Jew film. I'll go over some of it. You can go into much more detail. So again, give some evidence. If you're looking at a film, just put in parentheses what the section is. Minute 15, minute 19. You don't have to do outside research, but if you do, then just cite it. you should have, I mean, given the paper is about three pages, succinct introduction. Get right to your point. We don't have to tell about generalizations about, the Holocaust was X, Y, and Z. We know. Just go right to the point about what you're trying to get into. I would say the more substantial discussion of source material and how to make it coherent, the better the paper. Yeah, it would be great if you obviously didn't just summarize my lectures, but you can certainly build off them. Absolutely. It's meant to kind of give you a springboard for your own, deepening your analysis. That's really it. And you have 2 questions. I'll always give you 2 questions. They tend to be fairly open, so you can select different things that you want to look at. Obviously, the second question about anti-Semitism is going to be the basis of our lecture today, and it'll continue to a certain extent on Thursday. This will also kind of continue to cover propaganda. Okay. Any other, I know, one other thing. PT numbers, sometimes people are still hoping to get one. I wish I could give you one, I can't. And its simple reason is that we have a limitation on the number of students that can be in TA sections. So if you're on a wait list, you may get in. I know there's been a little bit of movement there, but not a lot. And I could just say the class will be offered again in the future, probably next year. So, other questions? Anything? No? Okay, so I'm going to close that. So today we're beginning, so last week, obviously the lecture was on the topic of the rise of fascism. Here I want to talk a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism, and on Thursday it'll culminate in us trying to understand the beginnings of the Holocaust and genocide. And we'll do this in a comparative way, like I introduced on the first day, which is to say it's not the only time in history that you have a group of people who wanted to exterminate another group from the face of the earth, but what we can learn about the persistence of the history of genocide in human civilization, and also specifically in the 20th century, given both Hitler's interest in antecedents to the Holocaust by looking at the Armenian genocide, as well as I mentioned the Herero genocide perpetrated by the Germans in Africa, as well as moving forward to other instances that have come since the Holocaust after 1945. So that's where we're going. So let me go ahead and bring up this slide. So from current slide, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about the history of anti-Semitism today, and that'll take us up to the film The Eternal Jew. Okay, good. So yeah, this is a term that I think most of us have heard of, but perhaps we haven't fully understood where it began, and also different variations of anti-Semitism over time. So anti-Semitism is a term, believe it or not, that was only coined in the 19th century, but it exhibits a tendency that has been around for at least 2 millennia, which could be called anti-Jewish or hatred of Jews for various differences that they exhibited. And those differences could be based on religious differences, linguistic or ethnic differences, national political differences, racial differences, and economic differences. And I'm going to talk about all those today because all these aspects of anti-Semitism are also, I would say, consolidated in the film The Eternal Jew, which the Nazis produced in 1940 and showed throughout Germany. So there's a number of stereotypes that are also here that I wanted to address because I kind of wanted us to know, like, where did those stereotypes originate? Like, where did they come from? And how are they used? So religious differences, I guess the most elemental aspect of hatred of Jews would be that they are collectively guilty for what was perceived as being the crime of the killing of Jesus Christ. That is to say, it wasn't just that there were few, even if it was the Romans, that they are the ones that killed Jesus, and therefore, as a group, they have a guilt that is transgenerational and is carried with them, forever. Jews also the other basis for the religious hatred could be that Jews don't recognize Christ as a salvific figure, as their savior. And if you do not recognize him as your savior, then you are yourselves not saved, and therefore, insofar as you're not saved, you're condemned. So these aspects of religious hatred are kind of intertwined. Jews had different religious customs and beliefs, certainly, but the key is here that collectively guilty for a crime and also collectively guilty for not being saved. If they were to convert, they could potentially be saved, and conversion over time, forced conversion particularly, or going underground, being a kind of surreptitious Jew, was one way that Jews dealt with these two kind of, these two aspects of hatred. Another aspect of anti-Semitism is that Jews are different. As they say, they speak a different language, they don't speak a national language, they haven't assimilated, they're separatists, they have different schools, different dress, different worship, speak Yiddish or Hebrew, don't speak Polish or Russian or German, or if they do so, they don't do very well. And so there's differences there.
I need to replace the batteries.
Oh, you have to replace the batteries on my mic. Okay.
It's working.
It does, yeah. Are you sure that it's not working?
That's just what they told me at the office.
Okay.
They said they thought it was.
Okay, so we're going to continue with new batteries. Hopefully it was recording, but can't guarantee. Okay, so third thing, national political things. Jews not always citizens of the nation in which they dwell, and we'll talk about how this is the case. Sometimes considered as foreign elements, as as a group of people to be tolerated, but are not ethnic citizens of that nation. Sometimes they're able to assimilate, meaning become whatever the national body is, like become Russian, become Polish, become German. And this, at various times, is sometimes considered a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. In the Nazi imagination, Jews who have assimilated into German society have actually turned sneaky because they've actually given up, so to speak, their Jewishness and become German, and therefore they're dangerous, and that's the thing that undermines Nazi purity. So that becomes the basis of a lot of the hatred that is directed at Jews by the Nazis. We'll get to that. Racial reasons. That is, Jews are racially inferior, degenerate, kind of on that hierarchy of races that Aryans place themselves at the top. You have Jews and other Oriental or African races somehow at the bottom. And this very strange illusion of differences, right, where Jews, Africans, and Orientals, and all in quotes here, are considered to be the same is kind of this 19th century idea of propagating a worldview where white supremacy is grounded in a pseudoscience. And that pseudoscience is the birth of eugenics. So the idea that you can have pure races and that certain races are stronger than others and therefore have more of a claim to land and people and power and things like that. Finally, economic reasons, and these are probably stereotypes that persist through today. Jews control the media, they control banks, they are engaged in money lending, they hold the nation, their host nation, captive, and there is a historical reason maybe why some of these stereotypes have existed. For one thing, that Thomas Aquinas had actually kind of codified the doctrine that Christians are actually forbidden from money lending, and Jews are actually forbidden from most aspects of agriculture, as well as many other professions. And so one of the few professions that they were able to go into, in addition to just being artisans or merchants, was money lending. And there's a history of this, which stretches back for centuries in terms of how they were dealt with in the countries that allowed them to settle. Other kind of stereotypes that existed, and we'll talk about these as well, that Jews ritual murder, they kill Christian children for their religious ceremonies. There's no evidence this has ever happened. However, it's a stereotype that persists through the medieval period up to the early modern period. Jews poison wells, that they caused the bubonic plague. That Jews are condemned to wander the earth. This is where the eternal or the wandering Jew comes from, which is not only that the Jew has these essential characteristics that are unchangeable, but that the Jews are condemned to never have a home, and thus they're always kind of on the move, and therefore wandering and can't be saved. So eternal Jew has a lot of different resonances here. They have these long-term characteristics that can't be overcome. They're eternally unredeemed, and they eternally wander. All those things are kind of consolidated in the name, the eternal Jew. Okay, so where did the Jews come from? I mean, this is like you have to go back in time here a lot. When did the first Jews even come to Germany? Well, the very first Jewish populations in any Germanic region came in the 4th century, around 321 of the Common Era. So we're talking about, 1,800 years ago. They mainly migrated from the Holy Land via the Roman Empire northward, looking for opportunities, I would say trade, merchants, artisans, and we're talking about a couple thousand people. And there's some reasons as to why Jews began migrating out of the area of the Holy Land, and it has to do with the history of the Roman Empire. So you may know that the temple fell in 70 of the Common Era. This is when Jerusalem was under siege by the Roman Empire. For many decades after this, you have the Jews and the Romans at war. And when the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem and the Holy Land, Jews became part of the Roman Empire. And thus they were subject to the laws of the Roman Empire. Well, a number of centuries later, you also have the introduction of Christianity as the national religion of the Roman Empire. This is under Constantine. And this is the first time that you have systematic anti-Jewish laws introduced. 1, banning the building of synagogues. 2, not allowing Jews to worship as they freely anymore. 3, preventing Jews from holding any kind of elected office or government office. And finally, various ways in which they were stripped of citizenship under Constantine and after. So this is kind of the beginnings of anti-Jewish kind of treatment, and it largely has to do with the conquering of where Jews lived in the early part of the 1st century. This also meant that Jews began to migrate. This is a map of where the Roman Empire controlled all of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa shortly after the fall of somewhat after the fall of the First Temple. And we're talking about an area called Judea, which eventually Jews began to migrate through Asia Minor, many making their way in Italy and Rome, and finally in the 4th century, the first Jews settling along the Danube and the Rhine in major economic centers like Cologne and Bonn and Speyer and Worms and Mainz, countries that become part of Germany much later. Germany doesn't exist in the 4th century. It's a bunch of little federations, little fiefdoms, each one, so this is kind of, Germania. It's part of the Roman Empire, but it's really outside, kind of almost on the edges. Provinces, kind of called imperial provinces, because they're not central parts of the areas the Roman Empire controlled. And Jews were tolerated. So this is for about the period between the 4th century and the 11th century. You have several thousand Jews living in Germanic regions, largely tolerated, largely able to practice their religion, able to establish areas of learning, and this lasts until around 1096 when the Crusades happen. So we're covering tons of history here very quickly, and I apologize for its kind of very, thick brushstrokes, but I just thought you should know that, hey, there were not only anti-Jewish laws before the Nazis took place, but there were also like a reason why Jews were in certain areas of the world. Crusades. Crusades you've probably heard of. These were pilgrimages, primarily Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And those pilgrimages started in Europe and they ended in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem. They took place over a period of hundreds of years, or almost more than 100 years. But the most famous starting in 1096, but there was a second and third crusades. And these crusades were also generally kind of, you had people who were on these crusades making their way to the Holy Land that went from city to city, sometimes whipping up anti-Jewish sentiment, and along the way, riots and burnings of synagogues as well as Jewish homes took place. And so the first kind of somewhat systematic killing of Jews in Germanic areas, particularly this area along the Rhine from Cologne down to Speyer, you have between 5,000 and 10,000 Jews killed in the course of crusades in Germanic areas. More in other places of the world, but I just want to focus on Germanic areas. So another major thing that happens in the years after the crusade are systematic expulsions of Jews from areas where they were permitted to live. So Jews generally moved northward into Northern Europe and Central Europe, following, again, anti-Roman laws that were in place in the 4th and 5th and 6th century. And generally, Jews were tolerated in most of Europe up until a certain point. That point started to change around the time of the bubonic plague, and this is 1348 to 1350, where Jews become considered the scapegoats in many ways to blame for all the deaths that the plague unleashed. So many of the expulsions that take place happen around that time. But some had happened earlier and some had happened later, the most famous being the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. This is a large Sephardic Jewish community. And so they end up going to North Africa. Other Jews expelled, they get allowed to go to Italy for a short period of time. Other Jews expelled out of Germany throughout the 14th and the 15th century, and they moved further and further east into areas controlled by Poland and later Russia. So these are two kind of major things that result in population shifts, right, over time. I'd say three things. One, the anti-Jewish laws of the Roman Empire. Two, the Crusades. Three, the expulsions. All, centuries before the Nazis ever take power. Here's a little summary of sort of where we are. So if I was to put together some of the early history of anti-Semitism, one would have to go back to the beginnings of Christianity becoming a state religion under the Roman Empire, and the consequences that meant for Jews being treated as second-class citizens. I'd have to look at the history of the Crusades and the resulting pogroms and riots against Jews. Whole communities in Germany were wiped out at this time. The blaming of the Jews for poisoning wells during the bubonic plague, the kind of systematic expulsion of Jews, famously from Berlin in 1510. They weren't let back in until 1667, I believe. So nearly 150 years later, did the first Jew get to return to Berlin. Many cities like Nuremberg would not let Jews back in. They had walls built around the cities. Jews could live on the outskirts, sometimes do business in the city. But for the most part, all these cities had purged themselves of Jews. Perhaps one of the most famous in the sort of early modern period would be Martin Luther's tract on the Jews and their lies. I gave you an excerpt of this, or gave you a link on the course website. And why this is important is, one, he calls for explicitly the burning of Jewish synagogues and eliminating the Jews, but he also creates a myth which has stayed with Jews for a long time, which is that if you were to let them into your country, they will Jewify the country. And so the word here is Verjudung, which is to make Jewish. And this again goes to that whole idea that Jews somehow poison a national culture or undermine it. So he created this Jewification myth. Finally, I should say, why are the Jews wandering? Why do they not have a homeland? Well, again, if you're being expelled from the country or only tolerated for a short period of time, then obviously you're on the move. And so the wandering Jew myth originates in this period as well. Finally, I should say another, I won't have time to talk about this, but another major massacre of Jews, the largest one before the Holocaust, actually happened in 1648. This right around the period of the 30 Years' War, and about 100,000 Jews are killed living in Poland and the Ukraine, partially over battles around nationality and tolerance that had occurred at that time. So I'm going to kind of move quickly here because I want to cover a couple other things, take us up a little bit more to like the modern period. So I mentioned earlier why Jews are moving sort of eastward there into this region. So here, partially because they're expelled, but later there's a systematic reason, which is Jews are allowed under the law established by Nicholas II to live in what's called the Pale of Settlement. And this Pale of Settlement stretches between Germany on the borders here. This is really like kind of Polish areas, the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. So it incorporates, it moves from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. And so this would be areas around like Poland, Ukraine today. And by the end of the 19th century, you have about 5 million Jews living in this area. Now, it's not a huge amount of the total population. It's about 11% of the whole population. But still, this is where the vast majority of Jews in the world live. Why this is important is because, one, they're primarily Yiddish-speaking, they're primarily poor, they're primarily involved in crafts and artisanship and commerce, they're living in small towns, shtetls. There's a number of large urban centers like Warsaw and Odessa and Vilna and Lodz. These become major centers of learning for Jews. But this is especially important because if you look at the map of sort of where most of the Jews in Europe live at the edge of 1939, it's in the area of the Pale of Settlement. Again, how did they get there? They're expelled from the West in the medieval and early modern period. They were allowed to settle here when the Pale of Settlement was established in the 19th century. And then as Hitler advances eastward, suddenly all these Jews become under Nazi control. And this is also the region primarily where the Holocaust takes place. So that's kind of like big picture issues. I want to go back to kind of look at a couple other things here because I think there's a couple other elements in the history of anti-Semitism that we should know about because these stereotypes become very important for the Nazis. They really radicalize or accelerate these stereotypes and I'd say put them into practice in their government strategy. So for one thing, so look at this one. Nicholas II establishing this Pale of Settlement. It largely restricts where Jews can live. Again, they're expelled from major cities, in this case Russian cities, but also they had been expelled from Germanic cities. They were allowed to have real estate here, but not in other places in Europe. They're allowed to be in certain businesses, but not others. Generally, Jews are not allowed to be in agriculture. They're banned from most militaries. Only later, by World War I, can Jews serve in the military, or at least they served earlier in the German military, but they had served openly, and I guess I would say proudly, as of World War I. I mentioned the birth of eugenics as a kind of race science that took hold throughout Europe in the 1850s. But I should say one of the other things that happens are the kind of more systematic pogroms, which are basically are just another word for race riots, happen against Jewish villages in the Pale Settlement. And this is where you have the first waves of Jewish immigration, the first really big waves of Jewish immigration westward, often through Europe. They're not allowed to stay generally in Europe. They make their way to the United States and sometimes Canada. And so most Jewish immigrants that finally came to the United States, I mean, most began in this period in the 1880s, continuing through around the First World War. Obviously, there was some Jewish immigration earlier and much more later, but I think this is an important kind of historical turning point because they were escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe. This word, this phrase, the Jews are a misfortune, we saw this last week as a kind of mantra of the Nazis. It turns out it was never invented by a Nazi, but rather something appropriated. It was invented by a German thinker, philosopher, journalist named Heinrich von Treitschke, and he had written an anti-Semitic tract back in 1880 where he created this idea. In the 20th century, and this is really kind of taking us to now like the basis of so much of the Nazi acceleration of anti-Semitic stereotypes, the German military, I mentioned Jews served in the German military, fought on behalf of Germany in World War I. The German military, when things started to take a turn to where it looked like Germany was going to lose the war, the German military instituted what they call a Jew count, a Judenzählung, which was literally to look at every Jew serving the military, what their role was, their background, and whether they actually were loyal to the German Empire. Now you could imagine, such a thing in 1916, this is before the Nazis come to power, establishes kind of a state of paranoia and really suspicion as to whether the Jews can be Germans. Or maybe they're the moles in the army undermining Germany. At least that was the reason why the Jew count was taken, what took place. Then you have, in 1920, when Germany's lost the war, you have the idea that Jews were traitors, so that they're the ones that caused Germany's defeat, that they stabbed Germany in the back. We let them serve in the military and they undermined us. There's no evidence whatsoever for this. In fact, the number of Jews that had won honors and medals and had served in the army and who had died are completely proportionate to non-Jews who also won medals and served in the German army. And yet this myth that the Jews had undermined Germany really took off. And then we saw these things last time, which was kind of the explanation that we saw last week for the rise of the Nazi Party. Okay, so I want to say a couple things about this map before. We'll come back to it actually next week, but I want to say a few things because there's some really interesting things on this map. One, generally the number of around 6 million Jews is given for the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust. So it's an extraordinary number. If you add all these up here, you're going to come close to 8 million. So you're talking about, a vast majority of Jews killed. But remember that most Jews are not living in Western Europe. Most had either been, their families had been expelled, long ago, and the Jewish populations, even when they were let back in, never really grew. But also by this period, half the Jews had already left Germany, largely because they could. So when Hitler comes to power, you have around 510,000 Jews. Many had left by 1939. You have about 210,000 left. Almost the vast majority of these Jews would be killed in the Holocaust. Of Poland's 3.3 million, 90% are killed in the Holocaust. Many, close to 2.5 million Russian Jews are killed. Almost all the Hungarian Jews, almost all the Romanian Jews, most of the Yugoslavian Jews, about half were killed. Others escaped to Italy. Most of the German Jews killed. 2 out of 3 of the Dutch Jews. About the same for French Jews. Only 3 countries did most of the Jews survive. I wonder if anyone actually knows what those 3 countries are, out of curiosity. Interesting story, and we'll talk about why. Ideas? Anyone know? Well, one is Denmark, one is Bulgaria, and the other is Italy. And it's really interesting. Almost all 50,000 of the Bulgarian Jews survive, and we'll talk about why. And part of that was because of support of the government and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church in recognizing Jews as citizens of Bulgaria, not as subjects of the Bulgarian state, but they were considered Bulgarians. Perhaps first Bulgarians and second Jews, rather than first Jews and then Bulgarians. Same thing in Denmark, where Jews and the king, as well as citizenry, helped the 7,000 Jews escape from Denmark to Sweden. Sweden was, in fact, not involved in the Second World War. And then Italy, and there's interesting reasons why. Not all the Italian Jews survived, but a large number of Italian Jews survived. And partly because, partly because the Italian police did not entirely capitulate to ferreting out Jews in the ways that other local police did. And there was a certain amount of protection also among families and the church in Italy that allowed many Jews to not just convert, but also to go into hiding, and they survived. In almost every other country, you find complicity with the Nazis and complicity at local levels. And I would say that perhaps the one thing that allowed the acceleration of the Holocaust to happen was this complicity at local levels, where local police in very particular jurisdictions, worked with, people like who lives in your block or in your street, and you're working with them to help the Germans find them and round them up. That didn't happen systematically in Italy, it didn't happen in Bulgaria, and it didn't happen in Denmark. And those three countries are really interesting as examples of ways that resistance could happen and did happen in the Holocaust, but in other cases didn't happen at all. So we'll come back to that. All right, onward. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of Nazi worldview about race, because race in the Nazi imagination is very important. And oftentimes I'm using anti-Semitism and racism together here for good reason, in that the Nazis really saw the basis of their entire ideology as a white supremacist ideology. And anything that was not considered to be Aryan, pure, at this, white, was often considered to be degenerate. And degeneracy often conflated hatred of Jews and hatred of blacks and hatred of what they call Orientals. And that generally meant anyone outside of Eastern Europe and further east. They also condemned modern art. And one of the things the Nazis did in 1937 was create this large propaganda exhibition called Degenerate Art, in which they took most of the kind of movements of modern art, like Expressionism and Dada and Surrealism and Cubism, and showed the art as examples of the degeneracy of culture. And often, even when the artists were not Jewish, they often thought that the dealers were Jewish and that the only degenerate people would possibly display art that looked like this. The Germans, though, would have something like this. They would be great, militaristic, pure. And so simultaneously, they created a great German national art exhibition in 1937, side by side with this other exhibition on degenerate art. Well, the degenerate art show opened in Munich, and one of the things that it did was, show works of modern art that maybe you've seen, like, kind of expressionistic, Fauvism, work that often had multi-perspectival views, Cubism. The work of Picasso would be a good example here. The work of maybe Ernst Kirchner, German expressionist. And what they did was they paired the works of art with photographs of people that they thought exhibited certain kind of deformities, maybe birth deformities, autism, maybe were considered, had various disabilities. And the idea was, these are the kind of people that we don't want the Germans to become, and this kind of art exhibits this kind of tendency. So very, racially inflected and really, just an attempt to really exclude a group of people from the Aryan ideal. But I should also mention this word here because it's such a stunning, I think, example of the Nazi racial worldview. Vernigerung Vernigerung means niggerization. So it has the word Nigger in the middle. This is a Germanic, this is displayed in 1937 in Germany. What they're afraid of is the niggerization of music, theater, and art through examples like this. And so they considered the influences of jazz, they considered the influences of black artists in Germany, performers, cabaret, music, makers of art, to be on the same base level of what the Jews were trying to propagate. And so their whole worldview is, we're being contaminated by these different races, and these different races are inferior. So what this says in German is something like, just as the niggerization of music and the theater, we're seeing the niggerization of the plastic arts, which mean sculpture, music, painting, and things like that. And that's something that you have to fight in order to keep the racial instinct of the people pure. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the film and a little bit about the term propaganda, because I want us to reflect a little bit about how so we're moving from the anti-Semitism stuff to kind of the examples of propaganda. I want us to think how this is put into practice through visual and filmic means. I had mentioned last time that the Nazis were experts at using new media, and particularly film and radio, but also visual material and art exhibitions, as you saw, because they wanted to get their ideas out to the public. The term propaganda, I mean, just interestingly, has actually a missionary aspect. That's where it originates from, which is to propagate a faith, and you could say propagate a worldview. In the modern usage of the term, it's changed a bit, and the modern usage still has that idea of propagating something, but it's particularly, I think, understood to be propagating misinformation to advance a cause or a political view and turn that information, that misinformation, into fact, right? So how does it do that? How does propaganda become fact? And that really is, I think, our task today, is to try to figure that out. So I'm going to play a little bit of the film that we looked at today, and then I'll give you a tiny bit of background about that, so I can bring it up. It's, my computer sometimes needs to think about things, so let's see. There we go. I can grab the film from YouTube here. Loud. Let's turn that down a little bit. There we go. Just loud enough. Some more. Sorry, it's so loud. That should be good. You don't really need it that loud. So, first thing is ominous music, right? Propaganda begins with ominous, scary music. And ominous, scary fonts, right? So, this is a film that I mentioned was produced in 1940 in Germany. Was shown throughout Germany, but not to great success. Unlike Triumph of the Will, which actually was one of the kind of best attended films in the 1930s, this film wasn't that. In fact, maybe because it was the beginning, the war had already started, people were interested in other things, the film showed things to the public that maybe either they believed already or maybe didn't want to see. I mean, maybe that scene at the end of with the bleeding scene is something that disturbed people too much. But the idea of this film was largely to, in some ways, create almost to consolidate all these kind of stereotypes of anti-Semitism. Jews racially inferior, wandering the earth, engaged in corrupt businesses, trying to consolidate this Nazi worldview as to why the Jews should be exterminated. Now, whether the film actually, in practice, had that effect, as say, did the film cause the Jews to get exterminated? I'd say probably not, because there are many other things that were simultaneously going on. It goes all the way back to 1919, when Hitler already talked about excluding the Jews rationally from Germany. But the film fits within a lineage that you could say that the Nazis radicalized. And the film does a number of things. I mean, you probably saw. I mean, I'm going to play a little section for you. It uses, both kind of found footage. It kind of has an anthropological dimension. It looks at footage ostensibly shot by Jews themselves. It has this voiceover narrator who, is going to talk to you very seriously about, all the bad things that they've done. It's going to show you, statistics and facts, and it's going to have some maps, to demonstrate how everything had to have been. It's never going to have any sources. Which is interesting because propaganda usually has no sources. It's just presented as it's a truth unto itself. So the part I want to show you is around minute 15 here. Let's see. Yeah, a little before that. Yeah, maybe it's around here. So I'm going to play you just a minute or two of this film, and I want you to sort of think about how it turns its, how it creates, I guess, what you might call a sense of factuality, a sense of its own truthfulness, and it does so in a number of ways. So, turn this up a tiny bit. All right, so I'm going to stop there. So I want to actually hear from you, and I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. How does propaganda become fact? Like, what does the film do in order to make its worldview, or attempt to make its worldview compelling? What is the film doing? What is the film doing as a film? What do you think? Okay, so I'm going to just kind of say what you said. I mean, it takes it takes some facts, I would say, that say the Jews were actually in these places. I mean, even like that element of where it showed the Pale settlement, I mean, that actually existed, but it puts in its own narrative. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. It takes it extrapolates lots of different pieces, and it puts it within its own kind of almost worldview, like an explanatory framework. And that explanatory framework is, problematic, but. Sure.
And the fact that they presented that is very wrong, but also the fact that they are talking about Jews as well kind of makes you think like, well, this is bad and this is why.
Oh, yeah.
So it's the same.
Yeah, a couple of things that you said I think are important there. One is it makes a kind of either-or binary. You said associated black and white. You know, it's us versus them. It's, you know, the good Germans versus the horrible Jews. So, and it does so in a way that presents, it kind of creates an emotional revulsion. You said revolting. I mean, you look at these rats, you're like, oh my gosh, the rats, they're bringing disease. Or this poor horse, I mean, the Germans would never do that. They would never hurt an animal, as we learned. But, you know, it's okay to kill 6 million rats, right? Rats. There was someone over here?
Well, it starts from this very simple, you know, map, and then without even realizing, all of a sudden you kind of forget about what you're watching, and all of a sudden the entire world map is filled with the various routes that these Jews have apparently taken, and it just starts from this small little dot.
Right, world domination.
Within seconds, you all of a sudden
Yeah.
cross the world.
Right, so the graphics, so propaganda works, of course, here by creating these very compelling graphics, right? It takes all those things that we consider to be objective. Maps are objective, right? They tell us worlds. Statistics, numbers are objective. Little dots, you know, moving across the thing. You know, we no longer understand like where these come from, but it does create this impression of you know, a threat that has to be negated, right?
It also didn't show where other people were moving in. I thought it really kind of perspective compared to other cultures could have been doing the exact same thing other groups.
Right, the comparison lacks context. I think that's a really important point. Or the only comparison you get are with Germans, and say Aryans. There's no other context given because it's always meant to establish an us versus them dichotomy. Propaganda always does this. It's always, there's a group who's the us, and there's a group who's the them. The them are demonized. The us are elevated.
And comparing the spread of the Jewish population to the spread of rats kind of also dehumanizes them?
Totally, dehumanize them, absolutely. And I think a large part of this film was exactly to dehumanize them, to make them kind of subjects of degeneracy, of being unworthy of life, certainly second-class citizens, and ultimately as animals that need to be, you know, exterminated like you might with rats or cockroaches or anything else. And this, by the way, just as a footnote, is a common trope of genocide. Almost always the group is compared to some kind of animal that needs to be exterminated. I mean, I give you an example in Rwanda. The Tutsi victims are always called cockroaches. It's exactly the same kind of stereotyping of a group of people that has undermined the well-being of some other majority. And it's always a small group, but they're very strong, and therefore they need to be kind of kept at bay. Other things back there? Sure. This one we're watching here, The Eternal Jew? Right. That's the film you should watch for today. Yeah, on the syllabus. Sorry. So I'm going to move forward. But no question is a bad question, so we let all questions happen. So I'm going to kind of summarize in the next few minutes some of the things we've already said, but there's a number of others that I wanted to add. Oops. Let's see, it's thinking. Okay, so here's where we were. So I want to talk about some of the aspects that make it appear documentary. Because there's a sense of, this film fits within a genre of films which might be called anthropological documentaries. You know, it kind of like goes into the environment where the Jews lived. I mean, you might see this as an example of films that, you know, go into, I don't know, the inner city and investigate how, you know, what it's like, and therefore extrapolate these wild generalizations of how all the people that live there must be. So it's ostensibly objective, right? It has all these characteristics that make it appear to be truth. The voiceover narrator, who kind of, you know, almost always male, has authority. It goes in, you know, to discover a truth that apparently is lying there. And it probably builds on stereotypes that people already have about the people that they're investigating. So it's like, yeah, I guess people in the inner city are kind of like that, right? And then you see this film which kind of takes it to the next level. I guess Jews that sort of live in these shtetls, yeah, they're kind of all like little beggars, and they look like that, and they're kind of haggard, and they're always trying to do things. It takes these stereotypes that people probably had in their head already and takes them to the next level. It presents images, facts, statistics, maps, behaviors, and things. And the important thing is they never tell you what the sources are. So it attempts, again, to, it's supposedly just documenting. We're just doing it objectively to expose this hidden truth. But it's always with the intent of setting up this absolute dichotomy, something that you came out already, between us, the Aryans, and them, the evil group that has to be, dealt with. And it's interesting that they do this in a kind of conspiracy theory-like way. So it's that group is undermining us, meaning those Jews are undermining us Germans, and if we don't stop them, they'll destroy us. So we have to destroy them first, right? The basis of this whole film is, look, they're undermining us. They have a stranglehold on the media, the banks. They're taking away, they're intermingling with, men and women, miscegenation. They're living among us. They're undermining our culture, our values, our humanity, right? They're inferior, subhumans, and degenerate, and yet simultaneously they're very dangerous. Even though they're all these things, they're poor, they're weak, they're inferior, they're degenerate also, they're also strong enough to destroy us. And this is always the paradox of sort of the Nazi worldview, right? The Jews may be less than 1% of the whole population, tiny little fraction, and yet they're strong enough to destroy the entire civilization. And so this is kind of that paradox, both simultaneously poor, weak, inferior, and yet somehow strong enough to destroy the Aryan culture, which is ostensibly the strongest in the world. So there's always that kind of racial paradox here. In the case of this film, there's another risk as well, which is the risk of assimilation, that the Jews would pass as if they're German because they've learned maybe the language, they've assimilated into German society, maybe they're not particularly religious anymore. They go to German schools, they look German. And I think in the film there's a number of figures that are given. I think Walter Rathenau was a good example of a Jew who had become, who was assassinated actually in Germany, but had risen into the ranks of government as if he was German. And their point was, aha, that's an example of a Jew who had assimilated so well that he could pass as if he was German. But ultimately, within the Nazi worldview, what the Jew is, and this is kind of, you've seen this kind of to summarize this, in a lot of different ways, is an emblem of degeneracy, parasitical because they live off of the host nation that is ostensibly going to tolerate them. They're considered to be equivalent to rats and vermin. They're lazy, sneaky. You have this kind of mixture of racial thinking, Oriental, Negroid, Jewish, all kind of things that are considered to be bad versus Aryan, which of course is held up. Mimicry, because the Jew mimics the true culture in an attempt to assimilate. Simultaneously has a stranglehold on German culture and yet is also the most weak. That weird paradox. This word niggerized, Vernigerung, the German word that's used here, horrible, obviously just a horrible word, but pointing out the way in which German racist thinking was always the basis of its political ideology and action. And considered Jews not to be religion or even, not to be, a religious group, but a kind of a group of racially degenerate involved in a conspiracy to undermine Germany. So you find this throughout the writings. I'll just read you an example from, I had asked you to look at Reinhard Heydrich, a piece by him for today called The Jews, the Visible Enemy. And it kind of fits within the same way we've looked at the propaganda in the film. It presents a worldview without any documentation. It presents basically a sense of a propagandistic, racialized worldview as the basis to give a reason as to why the Jews should be destroyed. I'll read you the first sentence. It says, "Since the beginning of time, the Jew has been the mortal enemy of all nations and people, joined by Nordic leadership and racial bonds. His aim, the Jew's aim, has been and remains world domination at the hands of a more or less visible Jewish elite. This is a goal to be achieved by any means and by any organizational form necessary, regardless of how stupid or ridiculous it may seem. The plan has been and remains the same. So, again, since the beginning of time, again, like it's an eternal characteristic. That's how the Jews have always been, since the beginning of time. There's no historical reasons given as to how this could possibly have happened. That the Jews as a whole, right, the entire group has this aim to destroy German civilization. And that is presented as just an objective set of facts. This is just how it is. They're just like that. And we are the victims if we don't do something about it. Propaganda always lacks differentiation. Always. Everyone is collectively guilty. All Jews are this way. All Aryans are some other way. It's always us versus them. It never has nuance. It never has context. Right? It never has sources. This is how it becomes compelling because it's just repeated over and over again. Since the beginning of time, the Jew has been the mortal enemy of all nations and peoples. Like, what a sweeping statement. All nations and peoples? Over all time? By definition, the mortal enemy? Where does this come from? And yet that gives rise to a reason as to why they should be exterminated. Right? A baseless claim, just said over and over again, becomes really compelling. It's often what Hitler would say. It's like the bigger the lie, the more compelling it becomes. The bigger the lie, the more compelling. Not the smaller the lie, the bigger. The more outrageous the claim, the more it sticks. So last thing I want to show you in a couple minutes we have left, I want to move to one other section of the film to just give you, and this is actually where Hitler is speaking towards the end, so let me go there. Again, I don't have time to go through the whole thing, unfortunately, but I wanted to sort of show you, 102 is where I want to go. Yeah, so here you see this, examples of revolting, there are the Jews carrying out a ritual slaughter. This has the effect of creating an emotional response, obviously, in the viewers. You watch this poor animal bleed to death, and therefore you see the barbarism of the Jews, right? This is where the film culminates. It's like the culminating scene of that's how they treat animals. And us Germans, we respect animals, and we would never do something as like that to kill a poor innocent animal. And then right after that, Hitler comes on screen. So I want you to sort of see that transition. An amazing kind of juxtaposition of images, right? You've gotten to that point of an hour of revolting images of rats, of infestation, of disease, of people that look haggard and, whatever, racially, quote unquote, degenerate. You finally see their behaviors, they kill animals, and then Hitler, savior figure, comes on the screen. So again, it's not footage that's here made up. This is an example of a ritual slaughter, and it's hard to watch, I suppose. It is. It's extrapolated as if this is the, well, you can take it for what it's worth. So an image, obviously, of suffering here, meant to show the uncivilized nature of the Jews.
Right after the Fuhrer took power, a law enacted April 21st, 1933, forbade the Jewish form of slaughter. It decreed that all warm-blooded animals be given anesthetic before slaughter. And just as with ritual slaughter, National Socialist Germany has made a clean sweep of all Jewry. Jewish thinking and Jewish blood will never again pollute the German nation. Under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, Germany has raised the battle flag against the eternal Jew.
So again, they establish that dichotomy of us versus them, our civilized world, our laws, and these degenerate practices of those Jews over there that do these horrible things, and we need to create laws that will protect us against them. And we looked at all the laws that were put in place last week. There's a law that I didn't mention, but one which I think is worthy of mentioning, which is banning ritual slaughter. So here we are in 1939. So this is on the anniversary of Hitler's becoming chancellor, January 30th, 1939. This is the Reichstag. he's speaking, and this is where he uses that term that I referred to earlier of threatening the annihilation of the Jews, so the Vernichtung of the Jews. So if the Jews, he says, drive us to war, right? If they're the ones that cause the war, we will annihilate them. This is the lie that is like the biggest lie. Like if you can imagine a bigger lie, it's like to blame the Jews for causing the war, and should they do that, we will annihilate them. So again, the bigger the lie, the more compelling it becomes. So you can see that. So here, should the international finance Jews inside and outside of Europe, he continues, push people into another world war, the result will be not a victory for Jewry, but the destruction of the Jewish race of Europe. So the Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse Europas. So this is the edge of the Holocaust. So this is like if we were like to actually turn the page now, we would move from this to the systematic rounding up of people and the data that was accumulated to find where the Jews lived and also what they owned, and to begin to put them into ghettos and eventually to carry out what we understand to be the Holocaust. So we've now, over the last couple of classes, approached the edge, right? Where we're at the precipice of where things now go from very bad to much worse. And so that's where I wanted you to understand sort of from a number of directions of how do we get to the Holocaust. And this is the other way that we get to the Holocaust. One is through the government of fascism, and the second is through the acceleration of an anti-Semitic worldview through efforts that are illegal and propagandistic like this. Okay, I wonder, is Peter Tukowski here? Yeah, there's going to be an announcement. Oh. Okay, I'm going to say one thing before we leave, which is we have a study abroad program in the German department that takes you to Berlin, Vienna, and Munich. And people may be interested in studying abroad, and I'm going to show you some information about that. But if you had any idea of wanting to go to Germany, you can talk to me, you can email me, or I'll give you some information about the study abroad opportunity probably on Thursday. So with that, I'll end today, and we'll resume Thursday.